You ever been involved in something that you started and you were part way there or almost all the way there and realized you had to start over? Major projects can sometimes be very disappointing, and they can take longer than we thought they would because of things like this. I remember a college paper I was working on in the mid-1980s. It was a major paper, and I was, not that I ever procrastinate, right, sweetie? Right up close to the deadline, within a day, and I had it almost done. And I was one of those kids, I was enough of a geek that I did most of my stuff in a basement at Cedarville, it was Cedarville College at the time, in a basement much like that, on one of those terminals. I had a typewriter, but I did everything on those computers. Why is this major paper 30 or 40 pages? Final project. Getting to the end of it, you know what's coming. Lights go out. In fact, lights weren't just out there. Lights were off at the whole entire campus. And guess what went with the lights in those days? Yeah. There was no such thing as cash, right? Where you're going to save that paper. And you could save it, but it was a process. Floppy disk, remember those days? The funny thing is, the professor, he wasn't all that. Yeah, he wasn't. He wasn't all that sympathetic. Using that as an excuse is more like the dog ate my homework. We had some friends of ours. This is a few years later. They were building a house, and they had the first two walls up, and the walls weren't looking all that great. What do you think happened there? The footer was off. They had to tear out the walls and the pad and start over. Starting over on major projects. This story that we read just a few moments ago about Noah's Ark is this, only on a much grander and darker scale. Story of Noah and his ark. This morning we're going to look at some key details of Noah's Ark from the Bible. And I know as we mention Noah's Ark, there are a lot of pop versions of Noah's Ark. You probably have seen the movies, looked at the cartoons, read the books, probably a story you saw in Sunday school. And usually Noah's Ark is along the lines of, hey, there's this nice merry little boat. Sometimes, especially kids' toys that come with music, and there's animals on the top. It's like, there are all sorts of versions of Noah's Ark that really aren't true. We're going to be looking at it this morning. But this story has its beginning in the Garden of Eden. And that's where we're going to start this morning in Genesis 1 and 2. We were there last week. And Moses, as he writes Genesis 1 and 2, describes for us the creation of the world. In 6 days that are recorded in Genesis 1, God makes everything. Everything that we see, anything that we can feel and touch, it's all made. Genesis 1 and 2. In fact, in those 6 days, God creates the world, the earth, the land we're standing on. He creates all the flowers, the trees, the grass, the sun, moon, stars, universe, and all the fish, all the animals. And at the end of it all, the crowning point of the entire creation, he creates man and woman. And Moses tells us at the very end, after he's done creating man and woman, God looked at all the stuff that he had made, and it was very, very good. Here's what God said about the creation of the fish and the birds and the animals, and this is key. This is critical to the Noah story. God created every living creature that moves and swarms in the water according to their kinds. He also created every winged creature according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, all the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. God saw that it was good. Now, this isn't simply an explanation. It is an explanation for what was going on the 5th and 6th days as God is creating the world. But I've tried to highlight it for you if you can read that. Notice the pattern there. These patterns indicate that all of this is not an accident. You've got God created, God made. This is all coming from God Himself. We find in the New Testament that the second person of the Godhead, the Son of God, Jesus, is the one who is doing this. According to their kinds, it's all done in a structure, in a pattern. There's order to it. It's not simply a mishmash. This Creator knows what He's doing according to their kinds. And you've got a description of all the creatures that are being created. And then at the very bottom of it all, both days, every day ends this way in that first chapter. And God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. At the very end of it all, God gives a pronouncement. It's His interpretation. You know, there's this rhythm where God says He's going to do something. God actually does do what says He's going to do, and then God interprets for us what it is. God saw that what He had done was good. That's the story of creation. And Moses, who's writing all this, as he's describing all this for us, we begin to get the picture when God declares everything to be good, that this creation is absolutely amazing. There's nothing wrong with it. What we're supposed to see is a world that is full of life, teeming with life, an overabundance of life, life everywhere, lush with life. Pick your superlative. It is absolutely green, and it's gorgeous, and it's lush, and there's plenty of animals, there's plenty of life, plenty of water, you name it. It's there. All according to their kind in a structure and order. It's all good. Even cats. I don't know how that ended up being good. I've got 2 extra in my house, by the way. What a wonder is creation. Even cats. But then, as we saw last week, it doesn't stay this way, right? It doesn't stay this way. Adam and Eve disobeyed God. Sin enters the world. Death enters the world. And pretty soon it's chaos. Adam and Eve are kicked out of their garden for disobeying God. Now they're given grace. They're given a promise. They're given a covering as they leave, but they're kicked out of the garden. And what we see after that then is the pattern. Adam and Eve have sons, they 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 have sons. As the story progresses. And what's interesting is that description then all matches this same pattern, except you get to the end of the description where Adam is having a son and his son has a son, and it says, and he died. It's a reminder that what was once perfect is no longer perfect. A couple of thousand years go by, and you can kind of figure out the timeline if you bother to put all the numbers together, but you're given this really, really long time period after Adam and Eve. A couple thousand years. And what's interesting is man left to his sin gets really, really bad. And it gets really, really bad. Here's how bad it is. Genesis 6, the Lord saw that human wickedness was widespread on the earth, and that every inclination of the human mind was nothing but evil all of the time. How bad is it? Look at the superlative words there. Human wickedness was widespread on the earth. Every inclination. Nothing but evil. All of the time. If you haven't gotten that by now, you're not going to get it. Because he wants you to see it's all bad all of the time. That's bad. For 2,000 years, from Adam to this point, people get worse and worse. And the rebellion is worse and worse. Every inclination of the human mind, nothing but evil all of the time. And evil has its limits, apparently, to the point where God finally says, we're done. Enough is enough. I'm starting over. And he does. And as the story progresses, out of the millions or perhaps even billions of people living on the earth by this time, there's one guy. His name's Noah. God tells Noah he's going to start over. He's going to start over. We're done with all this. All of it. Natural question that arises at this point as God is unpacking for Noah exactly what he plans to do and how he plans to absolutely start over. The question immediately arises, if you're following the storyline, well, what about the promise? Didn't you say you were going to send a Savior to fix this? If you do that, how are you going to fix the sin problem? How are you going to be good on your word if you erase everybody? There will be no seed to crush the head of the serpent. Well, the rest of this story is God making good on his promise. Even though it hasn't rained on the earth, God says and tells Noah, build an ark. Build a boat. Noah builds a boat. It takes him 120 years. And during that 120 years, he is making sure every person he comes across, everybody who understands, knows what's coming. And you get a hint to this in 1 Peter. He's preaching the gospel. Judgment's coming, but there is salvation. Here's what God says as that day comes where Noah is to get into the boat. Bring into the ark 2 of all the living creatures, 2 of everything, from the birds according to their kinds, from the livestock according to their kinds, from the animals that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. What does that sound like? What's it sound like? Sounds like Genesis. He's putting creation on the ark. The 5th and 6th days. It's all the same language. Now, he's not putting all of creation on that ark, but he is putting a representation of creation onto the boat. And that's exactly what Noah does. So then, again, if we haven't picked up on it the first time, Moses records for us. It's exactly what Noah does. All the wildlife, according to their kinds. All the livestock, according to their kinds. All the creatures that crawl under the earth, according to their kinds. Every flying creature, all the birds, every winged creature, according to their kinds. 2 of every creature that has the breath of life, all on the boat. This is simply a sampling. But God is going to make good on his promise, and that includes saving part of what he has already done. Saving the 5th and 6th days of creation on that boat. And that includes humans. The only people who decide that they want to be with Noah on the boat, Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives. And that's it. No grandkids, and there would have been. No grandma, grandpa, and there most likely was, if you look at the genealogies in Genesis 5, certainly. Grandma and grandpa aren't getting on the boat. Only 8 people get on the boat. Noah's 600 years old. God closes the door. And what happens next is absolutely breathtaking. Here's what Moses says. The water surged even higher on the earth. All the high mountains under the whole sky were covered. The mountains were covered as the water surged above them more than 20 feet. Every creature perished. Those that crawl on the earth, birds, livestock, wildlife, and those that swarm on the earth, as well as all mankind. Everything with the breath of the Spirit of life in its nostrils. Everything on dry land died. He, God, wiped out every living thing that was on the face of the earth, from mankind to livestock, to creatures that crawl, to the birds of the sky, and they were wiped off the face of the earth. Wiped out. Wiped off. Everything. Done. Gone. And you see the language again? This is the language of Genesis chapter 1. The 5th and 6th days, God is erasing it. God is reversing it. He is starting over. What was once very, very good, wiped off, wiped out. You think this language is stark? It is supposed to be. This is supposed to be a graphic novel, not safe for work imagery. As a story is being written, from creation to what we see here, we see that something moving from something that was absolutely glorious to something that is absolutely horrible, something that is absolutely horrific and terrible. And in the space of 6 chapters, even though there were 2,000 years between them, the way the story comes to us, it's not a long time in terms of chapters. Chapters 2 to chapters 6, 7. It's not very, we don't get too far into this story when we get a sense and we get a snapshot of what God thinks of sin and what He will do with sin. This is what sin deserves, according to our Creator. You know, I think of the trauma for us, some of us who saw those horrific pictures in the wake of the tsunami in Indonesia, or even Hurricane Katrina. You know, water let outside of its boundaries does absolutely terrible things. But what we have here in our text isn't simply a city at the edge of Indonesia or on the coast of Louisiana. This is the entire world. Nothing escapes this water. But the story doesn't stop there. Remember, there were 8 people on the boat and a snapshot of creation. So when this is all done, as the story moves along, we are reminded that there are still 8 people. And there is still a snapshot of creation. And so this is how Moses records what happens in the aftermath of them getting off the boat. Here's what gets off the boat. All the animals, all the creatures that crawl, and all the flying creatures. Everything that moves on the earth came out of the ark according to their kind, or by their families. Again, creation language. Now getting off the boat. The same language as Genesis 1. You see, God has done it before, and He is doing it again. He is starting over. This is grace. This is a new beginning. This is a fresh start. A new creation. God is giving 8 people forgiveness and mercy and life and grace as part of their creation that gets off the boat. And as the story goes, then He gives them a promise. That bow right there. I have placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth, and that bow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between you and me and all the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. God gives a promise. God gives a promise. He's always making good on His promise that He is going to save, that He is going to give grace, that He is going to forgive. And this promise is sealed by glorious colors, colors that emanate from creation itself. These colors throughout the Scriptures speak to God's glory and God's splendor. His creative acts in creating beauty, He now cements it with a promise. This bow, He is promising to be with His creation in this bow. He is promising that He will continue to make good on that promise, that He will send a Savior to fix the sin problem. God keeps His promises. He promised that He was going to send a seed that would crush the head of the serpent, and He, even in this moment of providing a bow, is saying, I am going to make good on my promise. As the sun comes out, the animals begin to flood the earth with a brand new creation. He's making good on His promise. He's making good on what He said. He loves Noah. He loves Noah's family. He's giving them grace. He's going to make everything okay. And like Eve, Noah did not live to see that day. There will be hundreds, a couple thousand more years. He doesn't live to see that day, but he does have a promise every time he sees the rainbow. And this is exactly what happens. This flood is our story as well. Again, few pictures in the Bible are so graphic in detail and so horrible to give us a sense of what God thinks of our sin, what God thinks of our disobedience. Few pictures give us a sense of what life is like without God. What life is like to be outside of God's grace. It's what we deserve because of our refusal to obey God. And we do it all the time. Our lying, our cheating, dissing of a neighbor, our selfishness, poor treatment of family and friends. We deserve, all of us deserve, to be on the outside of that boat, dying because of our unbelief and our sin. And without God, and without God acting on our behalf, that will be our destiny, or that would be our destiny. That's what's in it for us. Unless we have somebody to come and rescue us, to come and save us. And oh yes, He did. Along comes Jesus. who places us in the boat, and then he dies as somebody who is outside of the boat. Jesus dies in the water under God's judgment and his wrath on the cross. He's dying that death that should have been ours so that we might live. He becomes our ark, the one who saves us from the waters of God's judgment that would kill us. So the next time you see a rainbow, just remember Jesus. That rainbow is God's promise to you that Jesus died outside of the boat. It's God's promise to you that you are always in the boat because of what Jesus has done for you. That's the promise of the rainbow. Jesus died on our behalf. So what we do when we see a rainbow and we are reminded of what Jesus has done, we believe that. We rest in that. That is our promise to us. Rest in Christ's grace that Jesus perished in the floodwaters of the cross so that we would be forgiven and we would live and we would enjoy all the life that is part of the new creation.